Welcome to Raven Fjord, where winter is not a season, it is a full-time supervisor with bad manners. Tonight we follow Einar, Ingrid, and a longhouse full of stubborn people as they count fish, argue about spoons, and try not to get unalived by ice that lies with a straight face. Settle in, breathe slow, and let the cold stay outside. Chapter 1. First Frost at Ravenfjord. The first frost arrived like a supervisor who did not introduce itself and did not care about local customs. It spread across the grass in a thin, glittering crust, and made every footstep sound louder than it should. Even the ravens looked offended, as if the ground had put on a new coat without consulting them. Ravenfjord sat where the hills leaned toward the sea, and the pines stood close enough to gossip. In summer the water behaved like a mirror. In winter it behaved like a knife that had learned patience. The fjord did not roar or threaten, it simply waited and let people discover their own mistakes. Einar Stone stood at the longhouse door and let the cold bite his face for a moment. It helped him think. It also helped him remember that the season had no interest in his comfort. He watched the village wake into the pale light. Wood smoke lifted from roofs. A dog trotted past with an expression that suggested it was already tired of everyone. Behind him, the longhouse breathed with warm air, hearth smoke, and the soft chaos of morning. Ingrid Ashwood moved between benches with the calm precision of someone who could count stores by smell alone. She checked bundles of dried herbs hanging from rafters, pressed a finger to a small crack in a wall plank, and placed a wedge of wood into it without breaking her stride. It was not dramatic, which was the point. The cracks were never dramatic until they became emergencies. Harold Reed was already speaking to a cluster of listeners near the fire. His hands floated in the air like birds searching for a place to land. "Winter will test us," he announced, voice full of heroic certainty, as if the season had asked for his opinion. Old Bram sat nearby with his back to a post, half wrapped in a cloak. His eyes stayed on Harold the way a fisherman watched a wave. With experience, without surprise, with mild amusement at the inevitability of it, Soren Pike ran in from outside with snow dust on his hair, cheeks red, breathing fast. "The shore ice is starting," he blurted out. "It looks like glass." Ingrid turned her head slightly. The movement was small. Soren stopped as if he had bumped into an invisible wall. "Try again," Ingrid suggested, gentle tone, sharp meaning. Soren inhaled, forced himself to slow. "The ice is forming near the shore. It is thin. It looks dangerous." "Better," Ingrid replied, then returned to her work. Einar stepped out and walked toward the store sheds. They stood in a row behind the longhouse, low buildings with turf roofs weighted by stones. Those stones were there for wind. They were also there for the kind of comfort that only heavy objects provided. Winter was confident. Stones were more confident. Ingrid joined him without hurry, carrying a wax tablet and stylus. "You are reading the winter plan today," she reminded him. Einar kept walking. "I will read it, then everyone will look thoughtful, then Harold will look inspired, then someone will ask if we can ignore it." Ingrid made a quiet sound that could have been laughter if it had decided to take the day off. At the biggest shed they checked the lock, then stepped inside. The smell hit first: salt, smoke, dried fish, and the faint sweetness of stored berridge. It was the smell of preparation, which was also the smell of fear that had learned to be useful. Barrels lined the walls, sacks of grain sat on a raised platform to avoid damp. Bundles of dried fish hung from beams like stiff flags. There were pots of rendered fat, wrapped cloth around seal oil lamps, and coils of rope that seemed to promise they would hold if asked politely. Ingrid touched the sacks and listened to the sound of grain inside like someone listening for truth. "The numbers look decent," Ingrid observed. "Decent is not the same as comfortable," Einar replied. "Comfortable is a lie that winter tells before it takes your boots," Ingrid replied. They returned to the longhouse as the village gathered. People came in from the shore with salt on their clothes. Others came from the forest with pine branches and kindle. A few came from the fields hauling the last of the hay. Everyone brought the scent of their work. In Ravenfjord you could tell who had been doing what by breathing near them. It was efficient, if not always pleasant. When enough people had settled, Einar stood near the central post. The hearth fire burned low but steady. Smoke drifted upward through the roof hole and took some warmth with it, as if to keep the arrangement fair. Einar cleared his throat. He did not enjoy speaking to a room. It felt like trying to nail fog to a wall. Winter is here. A few nods. No one argued. That was the best part of winter. It did not allow denial. We have prepared, Einar continued. We have smoked fish and salted meat. We have stored grain and dried roots. We have stacked wood and repaired roofs. We have also made certain choices that will become very interesting later. Harold straightened as if he had been praised personally. Ingrid folded her arms. Her gaze moved across the room, not harsh, just thorough. People shifted slightly. They were not afraid of Ingrid. They simply did not want to disappoint her, which was worse. Einar read the stores aloud. Barrels of fish, sacks of barley, dried beans, turnips in sand, salted lamb, rendered fat. He spoke slowly, letting the list settle like snow, layer by layer. A long list made people feel safe, until they remembered winter was longer than any list. When he finished, he folded the parchment. Now we talk about rationing. The air changed. It was subtle. It always was. People did not like the word rationing because it implied the future was not generous. A woman named Tilda looked at the serving spoon with suspicion. If we use the large spoon, the first person gets more, she argued. A man named Rowan pointed at the pot. If the stew is thick, a small spoon will make us all hungry and annoyed. Soren, still eager and full of hope, offered an idea. We could take turns serving each other to make it fair. Silence followed. No cruel silence, just the kind of silence that let a young man feel his own suggestion fully. Old Bram leaned forward. The trouble with fairness is that everyone agrees with it until it touches their bowl. A few people smiled. The smile was tired but real. Ingrid stepped closer to the pot. Same spoon for everyone, she declared. The spoons stay in a basket. If a spoon goes missing, we will know. Rowan blinked. Howd. Ingrid looked at him calmly. Because the person with the hidden spoon will suddenly become very pleased with their own cleverness. No one in this village can hide that. A small ripple of laughter moved through the longhouse. It was quiet laughter, careful laughter, the kind meant to warm without waking the storm outside. Einar nodded and continued. We will eat well when we can. We will eat less when we must. We will not pretend hunger is noble. Hunger is a teacher. It is also unpleasant. We will learn, and then we will send it away. Harold raised a hand, as if addressing a great assembly. We should also remember our courage. Bram tilted his head. Courage is helpful, Bram allowed, but it tastes terrible when boiled. More soft laughter. Harold lowered his hand but kept his heroic expression. He could not help himself. It was a medical condition. After the meeting, the day became a chain of tasks. Winter planning was never one task. Winter planning was everything, all at once, and then again tomorrow. Einar and Ingrid went to the smokehouse. It stood close to the water, built low with thick walls and a turf roof. Inside, racks held fish and meat darkened by smoke, stiff and dry. The smell was sharp and deep, like a memory of summer set on fire and saved. Harold followed with a lantern and a sense of ceremony. Behold, he announced, the fortress of flavour. Ingrid looked around. It is a shed that smells like a warning. Harold nodded as if that proved his point. Einar checked the vents. Good airflow kept the smoke moving, kept the cure steady, kept the food safe. He ran his fingers along the wood to feel for damp. Ingrid checked knots and ropes, tightened a loop, adjusted a hanging line. Everything she touched became more orderly. Outside, the wind shifted, the smoke wavered. Ingrid noticed immediately, the wind has opinions today. Einar stepped out and looked at the sky. A grey band moved in from the sea. It was low, heavy and confident, which was never a good sign. Roofs, Einar decided, now. People climbed ladders and hammered pegs. They dragged extra stones onto roofs. They stuffed moss into gaps. They tightened ropes around door frames. The village sounded like a determined workshop. Soren carried a bucket of pegs, tripped on frost and sat down hard. He stared at the ground, offended by physics. Einar offered a hand. Winter is already correcting you. Soren took the hand and stood, brushing his clothes with dignity that did not quite fit the situation. "It is early," Soren muttered. "Winter is rarely late." The storm did not fully arrive, it tested. The wind pushed, the walls creaked, the roofs held. Snow fell lightly, then stopped, as if the sky wanted to see how they reacted before committing to anything serious. By evening the longhouse filled with the steady comfort of cooking. Ingrid stirred a stew of barley, dried fish and onions. The smell rose thick and warm. People sat close to the fire, mending clothes, carving small tools, rubbing hands together. Dogs curled near feet. Outside, the cold pressed against the walls like a curious stranger. Old Bram began a story with the gentle rhythm he used for winter nights. "Once," he began, "a man tried to outlast winter by arguing with it." Harold leaned in, almost whispering, "Did he win?" Bram looked at Harold as if measuring whether Harold was serious. Winter did not notice him. Harold looked briefly disappointed. Then he looked impressed, as if Winter had performed a clever trick. The story continued, full of small lessons hidden inside humour. How to keep boots dry. How to dry fish without letting the damp return. How to sleep without letting cold steal your breath. It was not fear-mongering, it was care, delivered the way Bram always delivered care. Calmly, with a hint of "I told you so" that made the lesson stick. Later, when most people slept, Einar rose for his night watch. The duty rotated, but Einar took extra shifts because he trusted his own worry more than other people's calm. He stepped outside with a lantern held low. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that made sounds travel far. The fjord lay dark and still. Near the shore a thin skin of ice had formed, reflecting starlight like scattered glass. Einar walked the shoreline and listened. The ice made small popping sounds, little cracks and sighs. It sounded almost like speech if you were tired enough and had spent the day counting barrels and hopes. He stopped and watched the ice spread. It was slow, patient, certain. That certainty bothered him. People could be bargained with, winter could not. He spoke softly into the dark, not expecting an answer. "If you are here to judge, be fair." The pines rustled. The fjord answered with another gentle crack, like a laugh that refused to admit it was laughing. Einar turned back toward the longhouse. Warm light leaked through gaps in the wood. It looked small against the dark, and yet it was everything. He felt the size of winter for a moment. Then he felt the size of the village behind that light. Stored food, stacked wood, hands that would work, stubbornness that would not let the season take the best seat. He returned to the door, shut it carefully, and let warmth wrap around him like a cloak. Chapter 2. The Longhouse Ledger War. By the second morning, Ravenfjord had developed a winter personality. Doors shut faster, people walked with smaller steps. Words were used with more care outdoors, as if speech itself leaked heat. Inside the longhouse, the fire became the centre of everything, and everyone pretended that was a tradition, not a necessity. Breakfast was porridge, thick enough to be respectable, thin enough to remind everyone that winter held the budget. The pot sat near the hearth. The lad rested beside it like a tool of government. Einar watched the line form, he watched eyes. In summer, people looked at each other. In winter, people looked at bowls first, then at each other. Ingrid served with steady rhythm, same scoop, same pause, same calm. She did not glare, she did not need to. Her calm was sharper than a glare because it carried certainty. Harold leaned toward Einar, voice lowered in theatrical seriousness. "This is not breakfast. This is diplomacy." Einar looked at the porridge. "Diplomacy usually tastes worse," he replied. A child named Mira stared into her bowl. "It is thin." Ingrid kept her gaze on the pot. "It is warm." Mira frowned. "Warm is not a flavour." Old Bram, across the fire, lifted his head slightly. "In winter, warm is absolutely a flavour. It is the flavour of continuing." Mira ate anyway, annoyed but obedient to survival. After breakfast, Einar and Ingrid went to the store sheds for the first full audit of the season. It was a ritual that made the village feel less helpless. If you counted your stores, you could pretend you were counting your chances. Ingrid carried her wax tablet. Einar carried his parchment and a pouch of chalk. Harold followed because Harold believed important moments required witnesses. Soren followed because Soren believed important moments required him. "We will count," Ingrid reminded them. We will not guess. Harold placed a hand on his chest. I never guess. Einar did not even look at him. You guess constantly. You just guess with confidence. They started with grain. Ingrid read the marks on the sacks and scratched notes into the wax. Einar lifted corners, listened to the soft slide of kernels, checked for damp smell, then beans, then dried fish. At the salted meat barrels, Ingrid paused. Her palm rested on a lid. This one feels lighter than it should. Einar tapped the barrel. The sound was hollow in a way that made his stomach tighten. Open it. The lid came off. Inside was salted lamb, but not enough. The barrel looked honest and embarrassed, as if it had tried its best but someone had made decisions without telling it. Soren stared. Is it theft? Ingrid did not rush to drama. It could be. It could be poor counting. It could be someone borrowing without understand that Winter does not believe in borrowing. Harold straightened like a man preparing for a heroic role. If someone is taking food, I will find them. Einar made a chalk mark on the barrel. You will find them by giving speeches at random. Harold looked wounded. My speeches are targeted. Ingrid kept her eyes on the barrel. At what? At the spirit of the village, Harold insisted. Bram, who had followed at a slower pace and now stood in the doorway, offered quiet commentary. A speech is a fine net for catching fish that already want to jump into your boat. Harold frowned, which made Bram look satisfied. Einar wrote a note. No accusations, we tighten the system, we mark every barrowed. We check twice, we watch for patterns. If someone took this, fear is involved. Fear makes people clever, sometimes too clever. Ingrid nodded, and fear spreads if it is not addressed. They continued. Most numbers matched the plan. Fish stores were strong, grain was decent if rationing held. The dried berries were fewer than Einar liked, but berries were luxury, and Winter disliked luxury. The oil lamps looked sound. The wood stacks were adequate, though Einar noticed the best pieces were closest to certain doors, which was a mystery that solved itself. As they left the shed, the daylight looked pale and delicate, the kind of light that did not stay long. Soren shifted from foot to foot, energy leaking out of him. I can check the river ice. Einar considered. Thin ice was a liar. Thin ice did not announce itself. It waited for confidence. Go, Einar decided. Take Rowan. Do not step where it looks pretty. Pretty as a trap. Soren nodded and ran off with renewed purpose. Harold watched him go. Youth is fearless, Ingrid replied without looking up. Youth is loud. The incident happened late morning. A shout rose from the river path, feet pounded on frozen ground. Einar was splitting kindling when he heard it. He set the axe down carefully. An injury from your own tool was the kind of humiliation Winter treasured. He ran with Ingrid close behind. Harold arrived too, pulled by the scent of drama the way a dog was pulled by the scent of meat. By the time they reached the riverbank, Rowan was kneeling near the edge. Soren stood a few steps back, sleeves dripping, face pale, teeth chattering. His eyes were wide but present. Rowan looked up. The ice broke. He stepped. It gave. I grabbed him. Soren stared at the river like it had personally betrayed him. It looked solid. Ingrid assessed him quickly. No visible injury, only cold and fear. Good. That could be fixed. Move, Ingrid ordered gently. Now, we warm you. We do not argue with water. They got Soren into the longhouse, peeled off wet layers near the fire, wrapped him in blankets. Ingrid pressed a cup of warm broth into his hands. It was plain. It was not meant to be impressive. It was meant to keep him inside his body. Harold hovered, eager to turn the event into a cautionary tale that would somehow include his own bravery. This proves Winter must be respected. Einar looked at Soren. Winter is respected. Now we dry him. Respect can wait. Old Bram crouched near Soren, voice low and steady. You have learned the first truth of river ice. It looks like a road and behaves like a lie. Soren swallowed. I felt the water pull. Bram nodded. Consequences are very strong swimmers. Soren managed a small smile. It was weak, but it was there, and that mattered. When Soren finally stopped shaking, Einar sat beside him. You did well to come back. You did well to let Rowan help. The brave mistake is refusing a hand because pride wants to look tall. Soren stared at the fire. I wanted to prove I could do it. Einar kept his tone calm. Prove it by staying alive and learning. Soren nodded, shame easing into understanding. That evening Einar called a smaller council near the hearth. Ingrid, Harold, Rowan, Bram. The parchment and wax tablet lay between them like sacred objects. The mood was quiet, but there was tension in it, soft and constant, like a string pulled tight enough to hum. The missing meat barrel, Einar began. The river ice. 2 reminders. Winter punishes both theft and mistakes. Harold leaned forward, eyes bright. We should trade. Orkney ships sometimes pass even in cold months. A quick run could bring grain and cloth. We cannot sit and wait for hunger. Ingrid watched him with that calm that made foolishness feel embarrassed. We can also lose people to the sea. Winter does not reward ambition. It rewards caution and timing. Harold lifted his hands. Winter rewards those who dare. Bram kept his voice even. Winter rewards those who remain alive. Daring is useful only when it has a plan. Rowan rubbed his hands together, still thinking of cold water. What about Yule? People are already talking. They want the feast. They want songs. They want something that feels normal. Ingrid nodded slowly. Normal is expensive. Bram answered with a small tilt of the head. Normal is also glue. A village held together eats better even when bowls are smaller. Einar considered the fire. Wood cracked softly. The sound felt like quiet approval, or maybe it was only wood being wood. Either way, he took it as a sign. We will do Yule carefully. We will make a meal that feels generous without being foolish. We set rules now so no one feels cheated later. Harold looked relieved, then immediately tried to add extra drama. We should make vows, grand ones, vows that echo. Ingrid did not raise her voice. No. Harold tried again with a smaller voice. Small vows. Ingrid kept the same calm. No. Harold sighed as if the world had denied him art. They planned the feast with measured optimism. Extra onions for the stew, a small portion of smoked lamb, a berry broth sweet enough to remind tongues of summer without pretending summer was near. Bram suggested a story circle after the meal. Stories warmed the room without using more firewood. Then they turned back to the real problem, the barrel, Ingrid pressed. We tighten the system without turning the longhouse into a court. Einar nodded. We mark every barrel. We check them twice a week. We keep the keys on a rotation. If someone is afraid, we address fear. If someone is greedy, we address greed. Both look similar when food is involved. Bram watched the flames. Fear and greed share a coat. Winter makes them wear it openly. After the council, Einar stepped outside for air. The sky was clear, stars sharp like bits of ice. The shore ice had thickened slightly, but it still looked fragile. Moonlight lay across it in pale bands. Ingrid joined him, cloak pulled close, breath faint in the cold. Soren is sleeping. Pride is bruised, body is fine. Good. Pride heals quickly when it learns. They stood quietly for a moment. The longhouse behind them hummed with low voices and the occasional cough. The village was small, but its will was not. Winter is a long guest, Einar murmured. Ingrid glanced at him. Then we will be polite, but we will not let it take the best seat. Einar felt the tension ease just a little. Not gone, never gone, but steadier. He looked toward the dark fjord and then back to the warm light. The season could press and test and judge. The village would answer with planning, work, and the quiet, stubborn humour that kept fear from becoming the only sound. Chapter 3: Salt, Smoke and Suspicion. The next day arrived with a wind that behaved like a bored critic. It poked at corners, tested shutters, and made the smoke from chimneys drift sideways as if the village had offended it. The sky stayed pale and high, clear enough to show distant hills, cold enough to make those hills look like they had been carved from old bone. In Ravenfjord, clear skies in winter did not mean kindness. Clear skies often meant the cold had settled in for a long stay. Einar walked to the smokehouse before breakfast finished. He did not announce it. Announcing worry invited people to join it, and worry did not improve with company. He carried a lantern even though the morning light was adequate. The lantern was not for light, it was for the feeling of preparedness, which was a kind of warmth all its own. The smokehouse sat near the shoreline where the air carried salt even when the sea was quiet. The building looked unchanged, but Einar trusted nothing that looked unchanged in winter. Winter liked to move quietly. Inside, the smell was strong and familiar, yet something in it was off. The smoke had a sharper edge. The air felt uneven, as if the building were breathing through one nostril. Einar stood still and listened. The racks of fish and meat hung in neat lines. The bundles were dark and stiff, the surfaces dry to the touch. That was good, but the smoke drifted in a lazy loop near the ceiling instead of rising cleanly. That was not good. Einar checked the vents. A crust of ice had formed around the outer opening, thin but stubborn, narrowing the passage. The wind had shifted, pushing smoke back in instead of drawing it out. The smokehouse was trying to do its work, while also being insulted by weather. Ingrid arrived with quiet footsteps and a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her eyes moved quickly. She noticed the same problem without being told. The wind has changed again, she observed. Einar scraped at the ice with the edge of a knife, careful not to widen the gap too much. Too much air would change the cure. Too little air would spoil it. The smokehouse was a careful conversation between heat and time, and winter liked to interrupt conversations. Harold appeared at the doorway carrying the energy of a man entering a scene that he believed required him. "I could feel the drama from the longhouse," he announced. Ingrid did not look at him. "Then your senses are working. Do not let them get lazy." Harold stepped inside anyway and waved a hand at the hanging food like a host presenting a feast. "This is our shield," he proclaimed. "Smoke and salt, the sacred armor of the north." Einar continued scraping ice. Sacred armor still needs maintenance. Harold blinked, mildly offended on behalf of poetry. Ingrid opened her bundle and pulled out a small bag of crushed dried herbs. She held it near the vent, then near the door, watching how the scent moved. "The draft is not steady," she concluded. "The smoke will cling where it should move." Einar nodded. "We clear the outer vent, we add a small windbreak, we adjust the inner flap so it draws clean." Harold leaned closer, trying to look useful. "I can make a windbreak." Einar finally looked up. "You can hold the lantern and try not to make a speech at the smoke." Harold held the lantern with dignity that did not quite fit the job. They worked in calm silence for a while. Einar chipped ice. Ingrid adjusted the hanging lines and checked the knots. Harold held the lantern and sighed loudly at intervals, as if suffering were a required ingredient in construction. Outside, the wind shifted again, but the new windbreak helped. The smoke began to move as it should, sliding upward and out, leaving behind its preservative gift without filling the room with sulking fog. Ingrid gave a small nod. Better. Einar breathed a little easier. A spoiled smokehouse was not lost food, it was lost trust in the plan, and trust was harder to replace than fish. They left the smokehouse and walked toward the store sheds to do a second check, because the missing meat barrel had not left Einar alone. It lived in the back of his mind like a splinter, not painful enough to stop him, but painful enough to make every movement noticeable. At the shed, Ingrid took the key from its hiding place and opened the door. The smell of salt and stored grain greeted them again. Einar stepped inside and went straight to the marked barrels. He checked the chalk mark. Still wet. He checked the lid. Still sealed. He tapped the side. It sounded full enough. That was relief, but it was a cautious relief, like warmth that you do not fully trust until your fingers stop aching. Ingrid moved to a different row. "This barrel," she noted, "the mark is smudged." Einar came over. The mark was faint, half rubbed away, not fully gone, but touched. "Someone handled it," Ingrid concluded. "Or the mark rubbed against something," Einar offered. Ingrid looked at him. In a shed where nothing moves on its own, handling is the simplest explanation. Einar knelt and checked the floor. Snow melt had not reached this far inside. The boards were dry, but near the barrel a few grains of salt lay scattered, and beside them a faint line where a barrel might have shifted slightly. A small shift. Not enough to steal a barrel, Enough to open it and close it again if you knew how. Einar stood slowly. We do not announce this, he decided. Ingrid nodded. Quiet correction, quiet watch. They left the shed and returned to the longhouse. The village moved through its day. Nets were repaired by the fire, clothes were patched with careful hands. Wood was split and stacked in the lean winter light. The sound of axes was steady, like a heartbeat. Einar watched faces. In summer, you could hide worry in laughter. In winter, worry showed up as hunger that made people quieter than usual. The missing meat might not be a single act, it might be a symptom. If someone was taking food, someone was afraid. Fear could spread and turn neighbours into rivals. That evening, Harold decided morale needed help. He gathered people near the fire after supper, when bellies were warm enough to tolerate words. Harold stood with his hands on his hips, broad stance, chin lifted. The firelight made his shadow look heroic, which was unkind to reality. Harold continued, building momentum like a man pushing a boat uphill. Winter has arrived, and winter believes it can bully us. Winter believes it can take our comfort, our joy, and our sense of belonging. Winter believes we will turn on one another. A few heads lifted. That part landed. The room stayed quiet, attentive now. Harold raised his voice slightly, not loud, just bigger. But we are Ravenfjord. We are salt and smoke. We are oak and iron. We are the hands that built these walls. We are the fire that does not surrender. Bram shifted on his bench and murmured softly to Rowan nearby. Fire does surrender sometimes. That is why we feed it. Rowan made a sound that might have been agreement or a cough. Harold went on. We will share, we will stand together, we will keep our hearts steady and our bowls fair. At the word fair, a few people exchanged glances. The spoon argument had become a legend in record time. Harold spread his arms in a gesture meant to include everyone and also include Harold. If any among us feel fear, bring it to the hearth. If any among us feel tempted to take more than their share, remember that the village sees. Remember that winter is watching. Einar felt the room tighten. Harold had stepped too close to the missing barrel without knowing it, or maybe he did know. Harold liked to sense a story and then poke it. Ingrid stood. She did not interrupt with force. She simply took the room away from Harold with the calm of someone opening a window. Harold is correct about one thing, Ingrid observed. Winter is watching. But winter is not our judge. We are our judge. We do not accuse in the dark. We do not whisper poison and then pretend it is medicine. If something is wrong, we solve it like adults, quietly, together. Harold lowered his arms a little, as if realizing he had lit a torch near a barrel of oil. Old Bram leaned forward, voice mild and warm. And we do not forget that hunger makes people strange. Hunger also makes people honest. When the bowls get smaller, the truth gets louder. So let us be careful with both. The room relaxed. Not fully, but enough to breathe again. The village did not need a speech. It needed steadiness. Harold meant well, but winter did not care about meaning. After people drifted to their sleeping places, Einar stayed near the fire. Ingrid sat across from him, stylus tapping once against her wax tablet, not nervous, just thinking. Bram sat to the side, hands folded, eyes half closed, listening to the longhouse as if it were a living creature. Einar spoke softly. Someone touched the marked barrel today, Ingrid answered without surprise. I assumed they would. If someone took from the stores once, they will test again. Harold, who had been hovering as if he belonged in this council, leaned in. So it is theft. Bram opened one eye. It is something. Theft is a word with sharp edges. Sometimes sharp edges cut the wrong person. Harold looked offended. Words matter. Bram nodded. Yes, that is why we choose them carefully. Einar considered his next steps. He did not want to set a trap that made the village feel like a cage. He also did not want to wait until the stores were half gone and the truth arrived too late. We will change the keys, Einar decided. Not as punishment, as routine. The key will stay with Ingrid and Rowan for now. Tomorrow, we check every barrel again and write the counts in 2 places, parchment and wax. If the numbers shift, we will know. Ingrid nodded, and we add a small sign. Not a sign with words, just a knot of coloured thread on each lid. Something that cannot be rubbed away easily. Harold frowned. That sounds like cleverness. Ingrid looked at him. It sounds like survival. Bram closed his eye again. It also sounds like trust, because you do it quietly and you do it for everyone, not against someone. The next morning, Einar woke before the longhouse fully stirred. The fire was low, coals glowing like sleepy eyes. He stepped outside and felt the cold slap his cheeks awake. The sky was still dark, but a hint of pale light sat in the east like a promise that did not intend to keep you comfortable. He walked to the store sheds alone. He did not take a lantern this time. The moonlight and snow glow were enough, and he wanted to move without announcing himself. At the shed, he paused. The snow near the door looked slightly disturbed. Not deep footprints. A scuff, a drag, a sign that someone had stood there longer than needed. Einar breathed out slowly. He waited, listening. No movement inside. The village slept. He did not go in. Not yet. He walked instead toward the edge of the longhouse where the shadows were deeper. He watched the door and the path between. If someone was moving supplies, they would likely return to check their work, because guilt and greed both liked reassurance. Time passed. The wind softened. A raven called once, then went quiet again as if it had remembered the hour. Finally, a figure slipped out from the longhouse side doors. The figure moved carefully, not running, not sneaking with exaggerated drama, but walking with a practiced quiet that suggested habit. The figure headed toward the sheds. Einar did not step forward. He waited until the figure was close to the shed door, then cleared his throat. Just once. The figure froze. Einar stepped into the pale light. He recognized the person immediately. Tilda, the woman who had argued about spoon sizes. Her shoulders were tight, her hands held close to her body as if trying to keep warmth and secrets inside at the same time. Einar kept his voice calm. Early morning for a stroll. Tilda swallowed. Her breath showed in the cold. The dull ache of understand. Why? Tilda hesitated. My brother is sick. Not badly, but he eats and then coughs and then eats again. He is thin. He tries to hide it. He thinks it is noble to pretend he is fine. Einar let silence sit for a moment. He could hear the sea under the forming shore ice, a quiet shifting sound like a creature turning in sleep. If he is sick, Einar replied, he needs warm broth and steady food. Taking from the stores without telling us makes everyone less safe. Tilda nodded, eyes wet but steady. I was afraid you would say no. Einar kept his tone even. I might have said no to extra meat. I would not say no to helping someone heal, but I need to know. Ingrid needs to know. We plan to keep everyone alive, not to win a contest in guessing. Tilda looked up. Shame and relief mixed together. I did not want people to think I was weak. Einar breathed out, a faint laugh that held no cruelty. Winter makes everyone weak. The only question is whether we pretend about it. Footsteps approached from behind. Ingrid appeared, cloak wrapped tight, face calm. She had followed the absence of Einar like she followed any missing tool, quietly and with accuracy. Ingrid looked at Tilda. Her gaze was not harsh, it was direct. Which barrel? Tilda pointed. The marked one. I opened it twice. Ingrid nodded once. We will correct the count, and we will correct the problem. Harold appeared then too, drawn by the idea of a secret being revealed. He looked at Tilda, then at Einar, then at Ingrid. His expression shifted from triumph to confusion, because the scene was not the story he wanted. So you caught the thief, Harold whispered, almost delighted. Bram arrived last, as if he had been awake the whole time and simply waited for the right moment. He looked at Harold without moving his head much. You caught a frightened woman trying to care for a sick brother, Bram observed. If you want to call that triumph, keep your voice low. The ancestors might laugh. Harold closed his mouth. Ingrid stepped closer to Tilda. You will not take from the stores without telling us, Ingrid stated. Not because you are bad, because systems only work when they are used. You will bring your brother to me after breakfast. We will make him broth. We will arrange extra portions for him for a short time. We will also arrange work shifts so he can rest. Tilda stared, stunned. You would do that? Ingrid shrugged slightly. We are not winter. We do not punish need, we manage it. Einar added softly, but you must trust us enough to speak. Tilda nodded quickly. I will. I swear it. Harold cleared his throat, trying to find a role that did not make him look foolish. We should announce this to the village, he suggested. Make an example. Ingrid looked at him. We will not make an example of sickness. Bram added, voice calm. If we announce it, others with private fears will hide them deeper. Quiet help makes people brave enough to ask. Harold looked down at the snow, chastened. For a moment he looked younger, less heroic, more human. It improved him. They went inside. The longhouse woke slowly. The fire was fed. Pots were set. The smell of porridge rose again, and the lad-aid returned to its post like a small official. Ingrid told a few key people what mattered. Not the drama, the solution. She quietly arranged a small bowl of extra broth for Tilda to carry. Rowan adjusted the ration records with Einar. The barrel was opened, counted, retied with coloured thread knots and sealed again. By midday, the tension that had lingered for days began to thin. Note gone. Winter tension never vanished completely, but it shifted from suspicion to vigilance. There was a difference. Suspicion poisoned, vigilance protected. Harold tried to apologize to Tilda in his own way. He approached her near the fire, awkward, careful. I spoke too loudly last night. Tilda looked at him. You speak loudly every night. Harold accepted that. True. I will try to speak less loudly about other people's bowls. That was almost wisdom. It startled everyone, including Harold. Old Bram, watching from his bench, gave Harold the smallest nod of approval, which was rare enough to be treasured. As evening settled, Einar returned to the smokehouse one more time. The windbreak held, the vents drew clean, the smoke moved like it should, steady and patient. The food hung safe, preserved by careful work and the refusal to ignore small problems. He stood in the doorway and let the smell settle in his chest. Salt and smoke. Not heroic, not poetic, simply effective. Ingrid joined him again, silent for a moment. The village will sleep easier tonight, Ingrid observed. Einar nodded. Not because winter softened, because we did. Ingrid glanced toward the dark shoreline. Winter will find something else to test. Einar allowed a small, tired smile. Then we will find something else to fix. They walked back toward the longhouse together. Warm light spilled onto snow. Inside, the fire waited, and so did the quiet work of surviving with as much dignity as possible, and with just enough sarcasm to keep fear from thinking it owned the room. Chapter 4. The Ice Road to Stonewick. The decision to travel inland arrived the way most decisions arrived in winter, quietly, reluctantly, with the understanding that doing nothing was also a choice, and winter kept excellent record of those. Stonewick sat a day inland along a narrow route that followed the river valley before climbing into stony fields. In warmer seasons it was an ordinary farmstead, known for stubborn cattle and better than average turnips. In winter it became a question. Could you reach it? Could you return? Could you trade without turning a simple journey into a long story that ended with regret? Einar did not want a long story. Ingrid did not want regret. Harold wanted a story so badly he could taste it, which was worrying. They gathered in the yard beside the longhouse while the sky was still pale and undecided. The cold had settled deeper overnight. Snow squeaked underfoot, a sound that always made Einar feel as if the ground were judging him. Rowan brought a small sled, built from ash runners and a frame of spruce. It was sturdy enough to carry sacks, but light enough to drag back uphill. Harold inspected it with the seriousness of a man evaluating a warship. This sled has spirit, Harold declared. This sled has wood, Ingrid replied. Please do not assign it feelings. Soren stood nearby, wrapped in layers, trying to look older than he was. After the river incident, he had developed a new respect for things that looked safe. He also had developed a new desire to prove he could be trusted again, which was the more dangerous part. Einar looked at Soren. You will not run. Soren nodded quickly. I will not run, Einar continued. You will not step onto ice that looks pretty. Soren nodded harder. I will not step onto ice that looks pretty, Harold added helpfully. and you will not try to impress Winter." Soren glanced at Harold. "I was not trying to impress Winter." Harold nodded. That is exactly what someone trying to impress Winter would claim. Einar chose the travel group with care. Himself, Ingrid, Rowan and Soren. Harold insisted on joining, claiming his knowledge of timber and weather would be critical. Ingrid agreed, which made Einar suspicious. Ingrid did not agree to Harold unless there was a reason. The reason became clear when Ingrid handed Harold a bundle of rope and a small toolkit. "You carry these," Ingrid instructed. "You will be valuable as long as your hands are busy." Harold accepted the bundle with pride. "I have always known I was essential." Einar gave the signal to move before Harold could build another speech. They started along the valley path. The pines stood close, their branches heavy with snow. The river beside them moved under a skin of thin ice that cracked softly now and then, like a warning muttered under breath. The light in the sky stayed flat and grey, as if the sun had decided to take a personal day. The sled runners hissed along the packed snow. Rowan pulled with steady effort. Einar took turns with him because fairness was easier to practice than to talk about. Ingrid walked beside the sled, watching the path, watching the trees, watching the sky. Ingrid watched everything. It was part of why people survived. Soren ranged slightly ahead, not far, checking the route where drifts formed and where old tracks might hide weak spots. Einar watched Soren the way one watched a small flame near dry grass. Useful, bright, risky if left alone. Harold brought up the rear, humming softly and occasionally pointing out a tree that he declared would make an excellent beam if only it would agree to cooperate. After a few hours, the path narrowed and began to climb. The valley wind dropped away, replaced by a colder stillness. The stillness was not peaceful. It was listening. The snow here was deeper, less travelled. Their boots sank farther, the sled dragged heavier. Einar felt the burn in his legs and the tightness in his throat from cold air. He kept his breathing slow. Panic used more heat than work did. A gust of wind arrived from the west, sharp and sudden. It lifted loose snow into the air and pushed it across the path in a pale veil. Ingrid stopped and raised a hand. "Weather is turning," she observed. Harold looked up at the sky, pleased as if this proved his earlier claims. "A storm wants to greet us." Einar frowned. "We do not need greetings." They continued, but the wind grew more insistent. It found gaps in cloaks and sleeves. It pressed cold into every seam. The trees began to sway and whisper, a sound like distant water. Rowan pulled the sled until his shoulders tightened. Einar took over. The rope bit into his gloves. The sled did not argue, but it did not cooperate either. It moved with the stubbornness of a thing that had never seen the sea and did not care about their schedule. Soren returned from ahead, face pinched with cold. "The drift on the ridge is higher. The path is covered. We can still follow the markers, but it will be slow." Einar nodded. "Slow is fine. Slow returns home." The wind thickened into a light snow, fine grains that stung cheeks and made the world smaller. The hills around them faded into pale shapes. The path became a narrow tunnel between tree trunks. Ingrid walked closer to Einar. "If the snow increases, we should shelter until it passes." Harold heard her and protested immediately. "Shelter means delay. Delay means weakness." Ingrid looked at him. "Shelter means not being unalived by a hill that cannot hear your opinions." Harold opened his mouth and closed it again, which was progress. They reached a small clearing where a rock outcrop created a natural break from the wind. A few stunted trees leaned around it. There was enough dry wood under the snow to make a small fire if they worked for it. Einar assessed the sky. The snow was not a full blizzard, but it was a testing storm, the kind that grew bold if it sensed arrogance. Their faces were already stiff with cold. Their fingers were losing nimbleness. Nimbleness was important when you needed to tie ropes or light fires. "We shelter," Einar decided. 1 hour. We warm, we eat, we wait. Harold tried to argue, but Ingrid was already clearing snow and scraping a small hollow for the fire. Rowan joined her without hesitation. Soren gathered branches, moving carefully and quietly as if he had finally learned that winter respected calm effort. Einar found bark and dry twigs under a fallen log. He built a small fire and coaxed it to life, not large, not wasteful, just enough to give them heat and something to look at besides white sky. They crouched near it, backs to the rock. Ingrid passed around small pieces of dried fish and a little bread. It was not a feast, it was fuel. They ate slowly, chewing with care, letting warmth settle back into fingers. Harold stared into the flames with the solemnity of a man witnessing destiny. "If we perish here," he murmured, "let it be known that I faced the storm with dignity." Einar looked at him. "If we perish here, it will be because you stopped moving to deliver a closing statement." Harold made a small offended noise, then took another bite of fish. The storm eased after a time, the wind softened, the air cleared enough to see the shape of the ridge again. The snow still fell, but it fell with less anger. Einar stood and flexed his hands. "We go." They moved on. The rest of the climb was slow, but steady. The path markers, small stacked stones and notched branches, appeared as they advanced. Soren found them first each time, pointed them out, then stepped back, letting Einar confirm. It was a quiet way of earning trust. By late afternoon they saw smoke in the distance, not storm smoke, hearth smoke, the kind that meant people were inside, warm, alive, and ready to negotiate. Stonewick came into view as a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a rough fence. The main house sat close to a barn, the roofs heavy with turf. A few animals moved in the sheltered yard, their shapes blurred by blowing snow. A dog barked once, then fell silent as if reconsidering whether barking was worth the energy. A man came out from the main house, tall, broad, wearing a wool cloak and a guarded expression. He held a staff more like a walking aid than a threat, but his stance was careful. Winter made everyone careful. Einar raised a hand in greeting. "We are from Ravenfjord. We come to trade." The man studied them for a moment. His eyes moved to the sled, then to their faces, then to Ingrid, because people always looked to Ingrid when they wanted to know who had the real authority. After a pause he stepped closer. "I am Mark of Stonewick. You picked a fine day to travel." Harold nodded enthusiastically. "We brought the weather with us. It follows me." Mark gave Harold a look that suggested he had met men like Harold before and had chosen not to unalive them purely out of fatigue. Einar kept the exchange simple. "We have dried fish and a little seal oil. We want grain, turnips, and if you can spare it, a bundle of wool cloth." Mark rubbed his beard. "Grain is tight." Ingrid stepped forward, calm and direct. "Grain is tight everywhere. That is why we trade now, while it is still possible. We can offer fish that will keep. We can also offer salt. Ravenfjord has good salt." Mark considered. He glanced toward his house, then toward the barn as if counting. His shoulders eased slightly. "Come inside. Warm first, then we talk." They entered the main house of Stonewick. It was smaller than the Ravenfjord longhouse, but well built. The hearth was warm. The air smelled of stew and animals and smoke. A woman with grey streaks in her hair poured them hot broth without ceremony. That was the best kind of hospitality. Practical. Einar drank slowly. Heat spread through him like relief. Mark sat across from them. "So, what is Ravenfjord offering truly?" Ingrid laid out their goods. 2 bundles of dried fish, 1 small jar of seal oil, a pouch of salt, and a coil of good rope. Rope was valuable inland where hemp was harder to come by. Mark leaned in, tested the rope with a thumb, nodded at the salt. "We can spare turnips and a sack of barley," he decided. "Wool cloth is harder. My wife has been patching the same blanket since last spring." Harold leaned forward, eager. "We could trade you a story." Mark stared at him. Harold continued, undeterred. "A very fine story, full of courage." Ingrid answered in a tone that ended the idea without raising its voice. "We do not trade stories for wool." Harold slumped back, betrayed by reality. After a few more calm exchanges, they reached an agreement. 1 sack of barley, 2 baskets of turnips, a small bundle of dried beans, and a short strip of wool cloth. Not much, but enough for patches and mittens. In return, Stonewick took the fish, the salt, the rope, and the oil. Mark stood and extended a hand. Fair trade. Einar clasped it. Fair. They stayed only long enough to let the worst light fade. In winter you did not travel after dark if you could avoid it, but you also did not sleep in other people's houses unless you had to. Winter made hospitality complicated. It was easier to leave while everyone still felt generous. Mark offered one more piece of advice as they prepared to depart. The river bend near the old pine is icing over fast. Do not trust the smooth surface. It is thin in the middle. Soren listened closely. He repeated it quietly to himself as if writing it into his mind. They left Stonewick as the sky began to turn a deeper grey. The storm had passed, leaving behind colder air and sharper edges. The sled was heavier now with supplies. It dragged harder, but Einar liked that weight. It was the weight of options. They made good time downhill. The wind stayed calm. The snow fell lightly, almost polite. For a few hours the world felt manageable. Then the cold deepened again. It did not announce itself. It simply settled, and their breath thickened in the air. Einar felt his fingers stiffen and forced them to move, flexing them in his gloves. Ingrid walked with steady pace, never hurrying, never lagging. At the river bend, Soren slowed. "This is the place," he warned. Einar studied the surface. Ice covered the bend, smooth and pale, tempting. But near the centre the colour shifted slightly darker. They did not step onto it. They walked the bank, even though it was slower, even though it meant pushing through brush and snow. Harold complained, but he complained quietly, which was a new skill. By the time Ravenfjord came into view, night had fully arrived. The longhouse light glowed through the snow, warm and steady. The smell of smoke and cooking reached them like a welcome. People met them outside, helping unload the sled. Ingrid directed the supplies into the shed with efficient movements. Einar watched the sack of barley disappear into the stores and felt something loosen in his chest. Harold announced to the crowd that the journey had been dangerous and inspiring, full of heroic moments. Bram, listening from the doorway, gave him a calm look. "I notice you are still alive," Bram observed. "That is a strong ending." Harold accepted this as praise. Later, by the fire, Einar and Ingrid reviewed the new supplies. The barley meant porridge could stay thick a little longer. The turnips meant stews could keep flavour. The wool meant mittens could be patched before fingers paid the price. Ingrid looked at Einar. "We bought time." Einar nodded. Time is the only thing winter will not trade back once it takes it. They sat in quiet for a moment, listening to the longhouse settle. The journey to Stonewick was over, but winter had taken note of their willingness to move, and winter always responded to willingness with another test. Chapter 5. The Sheep That Refused Winter. The sheep of Ravenfjord were not impressive animals. They were not large, they were not clever, they were not even particularly polite. Their main virtues were stubbornness and the ability to turn grass into warmth, which in winter counted as a kind of magic. Most of them accepted winter the way sensible creatures did. They huddled in the barn, ate what they were given, and looked mildly insulted by the cold. One sheep did not accept winter at all. It began on a morning when the sky was clear and the cold had sharpened everything into brittle edges. Einar stepped outside and heard a sound from the barnyard. Not the usual bleat of complaint. This was louder, more sustained, the sound of a creature insisting that the world was wrong. He found Ingrid near the barn door, already there, because Ingrid always arrived before problems fully formed. "The sheep is protesting," Ingrid observed. Einar looked into the pen. A small white sheep stood near the gate, pushing its head against the wood and making a noise like a tiny war horn. It stopped only to glare at the snow, then resumed. The other sheep looked away, pretending they did not know it. Harold arrived, drawn by noise and opportunity. "Ah, a leader among sheep?" Ingrid glanced at him. "Do not encourage it." Einar opened the gate slightly. The sheep shoved harder, attempting to escape into the cold world as if it had urgent plans. Einar blocked it with his leg. The sheep rammed him again, then looked up, offended. Einar felt a strange respect. This animal was foolish, but it was committed. Rowan came over carrying a bucket of feed. "That one again," Rowan muttered. "It refuses to stay put." Soren appeared as well, eager. Why does it want out? Bram, passing by with a bundle of firewood, paused long enough to add his opinion. Some creatures believe motion is the answer to everything. It is a common illness. Harold took that personally. Ingrid stepped into the pen. She moved slowly, not because she feared the sheep, but because calm was the only language Winter respected. She put a hand on the sheep's back. It tensed, then leaned slightly into the touch, as if it had been waiting for someone competent to arrive. It is not trying to escape, Ingrid concluded. It is uncomfortable. Something is wrong. They checked the barn, the bedding was dry enough, the feed was good, the wind had been sneaking in through a corner gap, chilling the pen near the gate. That was a small thing, but Winter made small things into large problems. Ina stuffed moss into the gap and wedged a board over it. The draft faded. The sheep stopped bleating for a moment, then bleated again, as if annoyed that its complaint had been addressed without proper ceremony. Harold nodded. It likes an audience. Ingrid continued watching it, or it likes control. They called the sheep Thorn, partly because it was prickly, partly because naming a problem made it feel smaller. Thorn did not become smaller, Thorn became more determined. Over the next days, Thorn found new ways to argue with Winter. It overturned a feed bucket. It shoved another sheep aside to claim the warmest spot. It tried to climb onto a pile of hay like a tiny ruler claiming a throne. Each time, Ingrid corrected the situation with calm efficiency. Each time, Thorn returned to the gate to protest again, as if the gate held the answer to all discomfort. Einar found himself returning to the barn more often than necessary. Not because he cared deeply about one sheep, he told himself, because the barn was a weak point in winter, and weak points deserved attention. This explanation was reasonable enough to believe, which was how Einar knew it was partially a lie. Meanwhile, Ravenfjord tightened its routines. After the Stonewick trade, rations were stable. Not generous, but stable. People worked with fewer arguments. The missing barrel incident had turned into a quiet understand that if someone needed help, they should ask before fear made them clever. Ingrid had begun making a daily broth for anyone who coughed too much, anyone who looked too pale, anyone whose eyes had that tired, glassy look that meant their body was spending more heat than it earned. She did it without fuss. She did it as if it were obvious. People accepted it with gratitude that they tried not to show too openly, because gratitude could feel like weakness, and Winter loved when humans argued with themselves about pride. One afternoon the sky shifted. Clouds gathered low. Not storm clouds yet, but clouds with intention. The light faded early. The wind moved through the pines with a low, steady sound, as if practicing. Einar walked the tree-lined path to check the wood stacks near the outer sheds. He had just finished adjusting a tarp when he heard it. A small cry, distant, thin in the cold air. Not a wolf. Not a bird. A child. He froze, listening. The cry came again, closer to the forest edge. Einar moved quickly but not wildly. Wild movement made mistakes. He followed the sound and found Mira, the child who believed warmth was not a flavour, standing near the tree line with her hands clenched tight. Her cheeks were red, her eyes were wet. She looked both frightened and angry, which was common in children and also common in winter. Einar crouched to her level. Where are the others? Mira pointed into the trees. My brother went to find a stick. He did not come back. I followed. Then I could not see the path. Einar felt his chest tighten. The forest was close, familiar, but in winter familiar places turned strange fast. Snow softened landmarks. Light vanished early. A small person could walk 10 steps and lose the world. Einar kept his voice steady. You did well to stop and call. You did well to stay here. Mira sniffed. I did not stay. I moved. Then I stopped. That was still better than continuing, Einar replied. He stood and called toward the village. Ingrid, Rowan, over here. He heard answering voices and saw shapes moving toward them. Ingrid arrived first, of course, cloak tight, face calm. Rowan came behind her with a lantern. Soren came too, carrying rope as if he was now the official rope carrier of the village. Ingrid assessed Mira with one glance. Then she looked into the trees. Name, Ingrid asked. Mira answered, voice small. Jory. Ingrid nodded. We do not panic. We search in a line. We call his name. We listen. Harold arrived as well, because the world did not allow emergencies without Harold nearby. He looked at the trees with the expression of a man about to declare something inspiring. Ingrid handed him the lantern. You lead the line. That way your mouth will be busy with breathing. Harold accepted the lantern with offended dignity. They moved into the trees. The snow was deeper there, soft and quiet. Branches hung low. The wind was gentler inside the forest, but the cold was sharper, held under the canopy like stored bitterness. They called Jory's name. They paused to listen. The world answered with small sounds, creaking branches, distant water, the soft shuffle of their own boots. Einar watched Soren carefully. Soren wanted to run. Einar could see it in his posture, but Soren stayed steady, moving with the line, calling, listening. That was the real proof of learning. After a few minutes that felt longer, a small voice answered. They found Jory sitting beside a fallen log, wrapped in a cloak that was too big for him. His nose was red, his eyes were wide. He looked ashamed. Ingrid crouched. Are you hurt? Jory shook his head. I fell. Then I could not find the path. Einar exhaled slowly. Good. We go back. You walk. You do not get carried like a sack of turnips. You walk so your body stays warm. Jory nodded quickly, eager to be useful. They returned to the village without drama. Mira ran to her brother and shoved him, then hugged him, then shoved him again. This was a family language that required no translation. Harold looked disappointed that no one had been unalived by the forest. Then he looked relieved, because even Harold preferred relief to tragedy, despite his hunger for stories. That night, Bram told a story by the fire, not about heroic battles, not about grand voyages, but about a man who survived winter by listening to small signs. The man noticed when the wind changed, Bram explained. He noticed when the snow sounded different underfoot. He noticed when his neighbour stopped laughing. He noticed when a sheep refused to settle. He noticed, and he acted before problems became legends. Harold frowned slightly. That is not very exciting. Bram looked at him. Surviving is rarely exciting. That is why it works. The Longhouse chuckled softly, careful with joy. After the story, Einar went to the barn again. Thorn was at the gate, of course, staring at it as if the gate owed it an apology. Einar stepped inside and stood still. Thorn turned and bleated at him, full of accusation. Einar crouched and checked Thorn the way Ingrid had taught him. He examined the hooves for cracks. He felt along the legs for swelling. He checked the wool for dampness near the skin. Thorn shifted and complained, but it did not try to shove him. That was suspicious. Thorn usually shoved. Einar noticed the ear, a small scab, a bit of irritation. Nothing severe, but in winter small irritations became large discomforts. Thorn had been protesting the only way it knew how. Einar found a small jar of salve and rubbed it gently onto the irritated spot. Thorn went still. The protest noise stopped. Thorn blinked slowly, as if surprised that the world had offered kindness without demanding payment. Ingrid appeared at the barn door, watching. You found it, Ingrid observed. Einar stood. It was small. Ingrid nodded. Winter does not care about the size of a problem, only whether you ignore it. Thorn leaned its head against the gate once, softly now, not ramming, not demanding, more like testing. Then it turned and walked toward the hay, settled down, and stopped acting like a tiny ruler. Harold arrived late, as always. He looked around. Is the rebellion over? Ingrid looked at him. The rebellion was an itch. Harold stared, disappointed. That is not a good story. Bram, passing by, offered quiet commentary. It is an excellent story. It ends with everyone alive and only mildly annoyed. Over the next week, Thorn behaved better. Not polite, never polite, but calmer. The barn stayed warmer with the draft sealed, the routines held, the children stayed closer to the longhouse. The village moved through days that were all similar, which was the secret dream of winter survival. Boring days meant you were still there to have more of them. Einar returned to the longhouse one evening and found Ingrid stirring a pot of broth. She looked tired, but steady. The firelight made her face soft. and for a moment Einar saw the weight she carried, the constant attention, the constant counting of needs. "We handled it," Einar observed. Ingrid kept stirring. "We handled it today. Tomorrow we'll ask again." Einar nodded. "Then we answer again." Ingrid glanced at him, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, like humour trying to stay quiet. "Winter is persistent," Ingrid observed. "But so are we." The longhouse settled into sleep. Outside, the wind practiced. Inside, the fire glowed. In the barn, Thorn slept with the others, no longer trying to escape winter, simply enduring it like everyone else. Chapter 6. A Storm with Opinions. The storm arrived 2 nights after Thorn stopped arguing with the gate. It came from the sea with the confidence of a large visitor who had already chosen a seat and did not intend to stand. Ravenfjord saw it first in the sky, a low dark band that swallowed the pale light early. Then they felt it in the wind, not the usual sharp winter air, but a heavier push, as if the world had decided to lean on the village and see what happened. Einar noticed the shift while checking the wood stacks near the longhouse wall. The smoke from the roof hole bent sideways and clung low to the ground. That meant the air above had changed. Storm air did that. Storm air liked to steal your normal rules and replace them with guesses. Ingrid noticed too, because Ingrid noticed everything. She stood at the doorway, hands dusted with flour, eyes on the horizon. "The sea is sending a letter," her expression suggested. Harold came from the shore path with his cloak flapping and his face bright, which was never a good sign. "A storm is coming," Harold announced, as if the wind had been waiting for his permission. Einar kept stacking wood. "The storm is already here. It just has not started speaking loudly yet." Harold looked pleased. "Then we must answer it with courage." Ingrid stepped down from the doorway and held out a small bundle of cloth. "You can answer it by carrying this to the far shed. The lamp wicks need to stay dry. If you are lucky, the storm will be impressed by your ability to walk in a straight line." Harold accepted the bundle with offended dignity and marched away. He did walk in a straight line, which surprised everyone, including Harold. By late afternoon the wind began to shout. It pushed at doors, rattled shutters, and found every weak seam with the careful enthusiasm of a thief. The longhouse creaked. The roof beams complained softly. Snow blew sideways in thin sheets that made the yard look like it was being erased and redrawn. Einar called the village into motion before the worst arrived. Wheat with speeches, with tasks, roofs, doors, firewood, water buckets, rope lines. Keep the animals sheltered, keep the children inside, keep the fire steady. People moved fast, but without panic. Panic wasted heat. Panic also made you forget where you put the rope. Rowan and 2 others climbed to the longhouse roof with extra stones and fresh pegs. They worked low to the turf, hands numb, eyes squinting against blowing snow. When gusts hit, they flattened themselves and waited like sensible creatures. The roof did not need bravery, it needed patience. Ingrid moved from corner to corner inside, checking drafts, stuffing moss into gaps, pushing benches closer to walls where the wind tried to whistle. She did not act worried. She acted busy. That was her style of reassurance. Soren carried water buckets from the river well earlier than usual, before the path could drift shut. He returned with his shoulders tight and his cheeks raw, but he did not complain. The river lesson had taken something from him and given something back. He moved with more care now, like a person who had been corrected by cold water and decided to listen. Harold tried to be useful and also visible. He brought rope, then announced that rope was arriving. He carried a plank, then declared that planks were essential. He carried a bucket of pegs and nearly dropped it, saved it at the last moment, then looked around as if expecting applause. Old Bram gave him the smallest nod. It was not applause, it was more like permission to continue existing. When the storm hit fully, the longhouse became its own little world. Outside was wind and snow and the sound of trees protesting. Inside was fire, breath, and the constant small movement of people, keeping everything from falling apart. The roof groaned as a gust pressed down hard. The fire flickered and leaned. Smoke swirled oddly before finding the roof hole again. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else muttered a complaint. Both were valid winter languages. Einar stood near the central post and listened to the building. He had learned long ago that a longhouse spoke, not with words but with creaks and shifts. A steady creak meant strain. A sharp crack meant something had given. A deep settling groan meant the structure had decided to hold anyway. The wind pushed again. A sharper sound followed, from the north wall. Not a crack, but the snap of a shutter latch. Ingrid moved instantly. She handed a child to another woman with a quick gesture, then crossed the room with a plank in her hands as if she had already planned for this exact moment. She pressed the plank against the rattling shutter and wedged it into place with a foot. The shutter stopped moving. The room felt warmer immediately, as if the cold had been watching and now had to stand outside and pout. Harold watched, impressed and slightly wounded. He wanted to be the hero of the storm, but the storm had chosen Ingrid as the hero, and it was difficult to argue with the storm while also being inside a building. The night deepened. The wind remained loud. Snow piled against the longhouse walls. Someone checked the door beam twice. Someone checked it a third time. Everyone pretended the third time was unnecessary. Einar made rounds, speaking low, helping where needed, lifting a bucket, steadying a ladder, adding wood to the fire in small amounts to keep it consistent. A roaring fire could be wasteful. A weak fire could be deadly. The fire required attention, like a stubborn child. At some point a thump sounded against the outer wall, heavy and dull. People froze. The dogs lifted their heads. Rowan tightened his grip on a carving knife, not because a knife would help against a storm, but because holding something sharp made him feel less helpless. Einar listened. Another thump, then scraping. Ingrid met his eyes, drift against the wall. Einar nodded, snow piling and sliding. It would add weight. It would press. It would make the walls work harder. He gathered a small group, Rowan and Soren and Harold, and they went to the door. Einar opened it only a little, just enough to slip out. Wind grabbed at them immediately, cold hands clawing. Snow stung their faces. They worked fast, shoveling and kicking snow away from the wall, clearing the drift so it would not become a frozen wedge. The wind tried to push them back. The snow tried to fill in behind their feet. It felt like fighting a very polite but persistent opponent who never got tired. Harold shouted over the wind, trying to sound heroic. "This storm respects our effort." Einar did not waste breath responding. Ingrid would have called that an unnecessary argument with weather. They cleared enough, then retreated inside and shut the door beam down hard. Warmth wrapped them again. The contrast made Einar dizzy for a moment. He steadied himself with a hand on the post. The storm did not care that they were warm. It continued. Near midnight a new problem appeared, because winter enjoyed variety. A commotion rose near the back of the longhouse where a few families slept close together. Two men, Leif and Corin, were arguing in harsh whispers that grew louder despite their efforts. Their faces were tight. Their eyes had the bright edge of fear. Einar moved toward them. Ingrid arrived at the same time from the other side, as if the longhouse had summoned them both. The argument was about space. A sleeping area near the wall was colder, and Leif claimed Corin had shifted his family closer to the fire during the evening without asking. Corin claimed the move had been necessary because his youngest child had started shivering. Both claims could be true. Both claims could be selfish. In winter, truth and selfishness often shared a blanket. Leif gestured toward the fire. "Everyone wants the warmest spot." Corin pointed at his child, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide and tired. "I will not watch him shake while there is warmth in this room." Harold arrived behind Einar, drawn by conflict like a moth drawn by flame. His mouth opened, ready to announce a principle. Ingrid held up one hand without turning to look at him. Her hand made a small stop in the air. Harold stopped. It was a fine moment. Ingrid stepped between the two men. Her voice stayed calm, which made it harder to argue with. Leif muttered that sharing sounded nice in theory. Ingrid nodded. Then we improved the theory. She looked around the room, assessing quickly. Then she directed a solution. "Move the benches, build a windbreak with blankets, put the children closer to the fire, all of them, in a line. Adults take the outer spaces tonight, Adults can tolerate cold longer without being harmed. Leif looked stubborn. Corin looked defensive. Both looked tired. Einar stepped in with low, steady tone. If we fight, we burn heat. If we work, we keep heat. Soren, standing nearby, added something unexpected. Voice quiet. I nearly went into the river because I wanted to prove something. It was not worth it. This is the same. Proving something is expensive. The room went still for a moment. Not because Soren sounded wise, but because he sounded honest. Honesty in winter was rare and therefore powerful. Leif exhaled hard and nodded once. Fine. Corin nodded too. Fine. They moved benches, they hung blankets, they tucked children closer to the fire in a careful ring. The adults settled to the outer edges with extra cloaks. The argument cooled, replaced by the quiet shared work of not letting winter turn them into enemies. Old Bram watched from his place and murmured to no one in particular. A storm is loud. Pride is louder. Good to see pride lose for once. Harold heard it and looked confused, as if he had briefly forgotten what pride was. The storm reached its peak and held there for hours. Wind hammered, snow hissed. The longhouse creaked and then steadied. People dozed in short pieces. Someone woke to feed the fire. Someone else woke to check the doorbeam. The night felt endless, but it passed anyway, the way all nights passed, even in winter. Near dawn the wind softened slightly, not gone but less furious. The sound changed from roar to long heavy breath. Snow stopped flying in sheets and began to fall more gently. Einar stepped outside again with Rowan and Soren to check the walls. The air was still bitter cold, but the wind no longer slapped, it nudged. The yard looked transformed. Drifts rose like small hills. Paths had vanished. The world was white and quiet, as if the storm had finished shouting and now wanted everyone to admire its work. They cleared the doorway area again, made a path to the barn, checked the animals. The sheep huddled, eyes wide, alive and annoyed. Thorn looked particularly offended, as if the storm had been a personal insult. Einar checked the barn roof. It held. He checked the longhouse roof. It held. A few stones had shifted. A few pegs needed replacing. Nothing catastrophic. The real damage was subtle. A cracked water bucket, a torn tarp, a section of fence pushed over by drift weight. Small injuries, the kind that mattered because they would add up. Inside, Ingrid began what she always began after strain. Soup. It was not fancy. It was hot water with onions and a bit of barley, and whatever dried fish could be spared without making the week too thin. The smell filled the longhouse, and the mood changed. A storm could not be reasoned with, but soup could. Harold sat near the fire, hair damp from snowmelt, face tired, finally quiet. He looked almost peaceful, which was suspicious. Peace usually meant he was planning a new speech. Einar sat on a bench nearby, hands wrapped around a bowl. His shoulders ached, his head felt heavy. The fatigue was deep, the kind that came after holding yourself steady all night. Ingrid passed him the bowl without ceremony. Her eyes met his for a moment, then moved on to the next person. That brief meeting carried more reassurance than any speech. Later, when the village settled into repairs, Einar stepped outside alone. The sky had cleared again. The storm clouds had moved on, leaving behind a sharp, bright morning that made the snow glitter. It was almost beautiful, which felt like an insult. He walked to the shoreline. The fjord had changed. The shore ice had thickened. The surface looked more solid, more confident. The sea had taken the storm and turned it into progress for its own plans. Einar stood and listened to the faint shifting under ice. He felt small, not in a tragic way, but in a truthful way. Winter was large. The world was large. His control was limited. The only thing that mattered was what he did inside that limit. Footsteps approached behind him. Bram, moving slowly, cloak wrapped tight, hands tucked in sleeves. Bram stopped beside him and looked out over the ice. Storm was loud. Einar nodded. The longhouse held. Bram glanced at Einar. You held. Einar did not answer right away. He watched the ice. He watched his breath. He listened to the quiet after noise. I was afraid, Einar admitted, voice low. That the kind of fear that makes you run. The kind that makes you count everything you could lose and then you realize the list has no end. Bram nodded once. That fear is honest. The trick is not letting it choose your actions while it is still hungry. Einar let that settle. Bram continued, calm tone. You did not shout at the storm. You did not promise victory. You did not pretend. You watched. You worked. That is why you are still here to be tired. Einar felt a small release in his chest. Not comfort, something steadier than comfort. He turned back toward the longhouse. People moved in the yard, clearing drifts, repairing fence posts, dragging woods. Ingrid stood near the doorway directing work without raising her voice. Harold carried a plank and for once did not announce it. Einar walked back toward them, feeling the cold on his face, feeling the warmth waiting inside, feeling the quiet truth of the morning. The storm had opinions. Ravenfjord had answers. Not loud answer, not heroic answer, practical answers delivered one board and one bowl at a time. Chapter 7. The Quiet Hunger Week. The week after the storm felt quieter, not because the village had less to do, but because the work had turned inward. Roof repairs finished, fence posts went back up. Drifts were cleared into walls of snow that made narrow paths like tunnels. Then the world settled, and the real challenge returned. The challenge that always waited behind the loud moments. Food, not no food. Ravenfjord was not desperate. But the stores had shifted. Extra meals during the storm, extra broth for children, a few sacks opened for repairs and then not sealed perfectly. Small losses that added up like drops of water in a bucket that had started life full and proud. Einar did the morning counts with Ingrid. They did not make it an event. They did not gather an audience. They moved through barrels and sacks the way a person moved through their own thoughts, careful, quiet, honest. The barley from Stonewick helped, but it did not make winter shorter. The turnips helped, but they did not stop hunger from sharpening attention. In the longhouse, bowls looked the same size. People looked at them longer. Breakfast was porridge again. It was still warm, still edible, still the closest thing to comfort that winter allowed. It was also slightly thinner than before. Not thin enough to spark argument. Thin enough to be noticed, which was more dangerous. Mira tasted it and frowned in the same dramatic way she always did, but her frown had less energy now. She ate without commentary. That change worried Einar more than any complaint. Ingrid kept serving with her steady rhythm. Same scoop, same pause, same calm. The spoon basket sat nearby like a small symbol of civilized behavior. Harold sat on a bench and stared into his bowl as if expecting it to reveal secrets. He finally looked up and spoke softly, which was new. We are entering the Quiet Hunger Week. Einar blinked. Did you name it? Harold nodded. Naming things gives power. Bram from across the fire offered mild correction. Naming things gives the illusion of power. The hunger still has the power. Harold nodded like that was exactly what he had meant all along. The village adjusted without being told. People ate slower, people drank more water, people became more careful about crumbs. Children were reminded not to throw bread to dogs unless the dogs were actively saving a life. In the afternoons, they turned to the fjord and the ice fishing holds. It was time to pull food directly from the cold and pretend it was a fair trade. Einar led the first effort. He did not bring a crowd. He brought a small group, Rowan, Soren, and 2 older fishers who knew the habits of winter water. Ingrid stayed behind to manage stores and keep the longhouse routine steady. She trusted Einar to handle the ice, and Einar trusted Ingrid to handle everything else, which was the only way either of them slept. The shore ice was thicker now, but Einar still treated it like a liar with a good costume. They walked with gaps between them, spread weight, listened to the sound underfoot. The ice spoke in small cracks and pops, and Einar listened like those sounds were language. They chose a spot near a known deep channel where fish moved even in cold months. The older fisher, a man named Garth, used an ice chisel to open a hole. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, steady. Ice chips flew. Cold water appeared below, black and moving. They set lines with bait, small pieces of dried fish, which always felt slightly rude. A fish does not deserve to be tricked with its own cousin, but winter did not allow polite morals. They waited. Waiting in winter had its own weight. The cold crept into boots. The wind moved across the open ice and found every gap in clothing. Fingers stiffened. Breath turned into frost on beards. Soren shifted from foot to foot, restless. Einar kept his voice low. Patience. Soren nodded. I am patient. Bram would have laughed. Soren looked like a person performing patience for an audience. Then a line twitched. Rowan leaned in and pulled slowly. The ice hole rippled. A fish emerged, small but real, silver against the dark water. It flopped and then lay still, eyes bright, body cold. Einar felt a small pulse of relief. Not joy, relief. Food meant choices. They caught a few more, not many, enough for broth, enough to stretch the weak, enough to keep morale from cracking like thin ice. They returned to the longhouse with fish wrapped in cloth. Ingrid met them at the door, eyes assessing the bundle. How many? Einar answered with the simple truth, enough. Ingrid nodded and took the fish without ceremony. Enough is a good word. That evening the village ate fish broth with onion. The smell filled the longhouse, and for a moment bowls looked generous again. Children smiled, adults sighed, even the dogs looked grateful. Then the next day arrived and hunger returned, quieter than before, more persistent. Midweek, a rumour reached the village like a cold draught. A man from the shore path arrived breathless, eyes wide. I saw something on the water, he announced. Far out. A dark shape. A sail or a mast. The room froze. Not from cold, from possibility. A ship in winter could mean trade, it could mean trouble. It could mean strangers who needed help, or strangers who would take help without permission. Winter ships were never simple. Harold sat up straighter, eyes bright. Trade. Rowan frowned. Or raiders. Ingrid held up a hand. Not raiders. We do not throw words like stones, we check facts. Einar nodded. We watch from shore. We do not rush onto ice for a rumour. Soren looked eager. I can scout. Einar met his eyes. You can scout with Rowan. Soren nodded, slightly deflated but obedient. They went to the ridge above the fjord, a place where the view opened wide and the wind hit hard. The sky was clear but hard, the kind of clarity that made distance look close and made mistakes tempting. They found the dark shape. It was real. A ship, far out, moving slowly along the outer edge of the forming ice. A mast stood, sail partly lowered. The vessel did not approach. It did not turn away quickly either. It drifted like something uncertain. Rowan squinted. It is not a big ship. Soren watched, fascinated. It looks tired. Einar felt tension settle in his chest. A tired ship in winter was a problem. It might be trapped by ice. It might be damaged. It might hold people who would do anything for warmth and food. Back at the longhouse, Einar reported what they saw. Ingrid listened, then began to think aloud with her hands moving bowls, shifting the spoon basket, making the physical space match the planning. We do not go to it, Ingrid concluded, not today. We cannot risk people on sea ice. We also cannot ignore it completely. If they come closer, we need a plan. Harold leaned forward. We could signal. With what? Ingrid asked, calm. A poem. Harold looked offended. A fire. Einar nodded slowly. A shore fire at dusk. Visible, controlled. Not an invitation to walk into our longhouse. A signal that land exists here and people exist here, but also a signal that we are not careless. Bram offered his quiet guidance. In winter, kindness must wear armour. Otherwise it becomes a gift to the wrong hands. They lit a controlled fire on the shore at dusk, a bright point against the dark water. People watched from the ridge. The ship remained far, sail lowered further, drifting. No answer came, no lights, no movement that looked like a response. The village went to sleep with the ship in their minds, a distant question on the horizon. The next morning the ship was gone. The sea looked empty again, the ice edge silent. That absence brought its own relief and its own worry. The ship had either moved on or sunk into trouble somewhere out of sight. Harold mourned the lost trade opportunity like a man mourning a friend he had not met. Ingrid kept the day moving. We did not starve, that is the success. The quiet hunger week ended with a shared meal that felt like diplomacy again. Not because the food was abundant, because the mood was. Ingrid arranged a pot with a little more barley than usual, a few turnips, the last of the fish from the ice holes. Bram offered a story circle. Soren carved small wooden tokens for children. Harold promised to speak less, and then immediately spoke more about the importance of speaking less. People laughed softly. The laughter was tired but real. Einar watched the room and felt the village hold together. That was the real store, the one that mattered most. Not the barrels, not the sacks, the willingness to keep being a village even when hunger tried to turn everyone into separate islands. Chapter 8. Candlelight Politics. When the food question quieted for a moment, the other questions returned. They always did. Winter did not create new problems as much as it revealed the old ones, the ones people could ignore when days were long and work was loud. In Ravenfjord, the winter assembly happened indoors by necessity. In summer, disagreements could wander outside and cool down. In winter, disagreements stayed close to the fire and warmed themselves like cats. The assembly was called on a night when the wind was calm and the longhouse was full of candlelight. Seal oil lamps burned along the walls, their light soft and steady. Shadows moved across beams, the smell of smoke, broth, and damp wool filled the room. Einar did not enjoy assemblies. He liked ledgers. Ledgers argued less. Ingrid liked assemblies because assemblies were where you made agreements that people actually followed. Harold loved assemblies because they gave him a reason to stand. Old Bram attended because Bram attended everything, and then pretended he had not. People gathered on benches, families close together, hands wrapped around cups. The mood was controlled but tense, like a rope pulled tight and waiting to see if it would hold. Rowan stood first, because Rowan always believed problems should be addressed before they developed personality. "We need to settle the timber dispute," Rowan declared. A low murmur moved through the room. Timber disputes were serious. Timber meant repairs. Timber meant sleds. Timber meant warmth. Timber also meant pride, because cutting a tree was easy, but admitting you wasted it was hard. Rowan pointed toward Harold. Harold used too much timber repairing his boat frame. He cut beams that could have patched roofs. He did it without asking. Harold rose immediately, as if lifted by his own indignation. "I did not waste timber," Harold protested. "I invested timber. A boat is our future. A boat is trade. A boat is escape if winter turns cruel." Ingrid looked at him, calm. Winter is already cruel. That is why roofs matter. Harold spread his hands. "Roofs can be patched. A boat must be built with vision." Bram muttered softly to the person beside him. "Vision is easier when you are warm." A few people smiled. Harold did not notice. He was busy being Harold. Einar stepped forward, not to take sides, but to stop the room from turning into a choir of overlapping grievances. "We do not need a winner," Einar began. "We need a plan. Harold, how much timber did you use?" Harold hesitated, which was not his usual style. He glanced toward the ceiling as if numbers might be written there. Einar waited. He did not fill the silence. Silence was a tool. Harold finally admitted, voice smaller. "More than I should have." Rowan crossed his arms. "Exactly." Harold lifted his chin again, trying to recover his heroic posture, but it was for a good purpose. Ingrid spoke evenly. "Purpose does not erase consequence. We will not punish you, we will adjust. You will repair the timber stock by cutting new poles when weather allows. You will also ask before taking from shared stores. That includes wood stores." Harold opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, likely remembering the last time Ingrid used her calm tone on him. "Fine," Harold agreed, grudging but honest. "I will cut timber." Bram offered a quiet blessing, and perhaps cut fewer speeches. The assembly moved on to other issues. The fence repair schedule. the rotation for night watch, the rule about children staying within sight of the longhouse after the forest incident. Each topic stirred small arguments, then settled into agreement. Then Soren stood and delivered news with the seriousness of someone who had practiced being serious. "I saw tracks on the ridge," Soren reported. "Not deer, not fox, wolves." The room tightened again. Wolves were not monsters, they were competitors. Winter brought competitors closer. Rowan leaned forward. "How many?" Soren answered carefully. "At least 2, maybe 3. They stayed on the ridge and did not come down, but they watched." Harold looked eager, which was not helpful. "Wolves will respect our strength." Ingrid kept her eyes on Soren. "They will respect our caution. We do not chase them, we keep animals close, we keep watch. We make noise when we move at night," Bram added quietly. "A wolf is not a villain. It is a hungry neighbour. Treat it like a neighbour you do not trust." People nodded. The tension eased slightly. Wolves were manageable if treated properly. Wolves were more honest than humans in some ways. Wolves did not hide their hunger behind politeness. The final topic of the assembly was the hardest, because it was not about wood or wolves. It was about fairness. A man named Corin, the same man from the storm dispute, stood and spoke with careful restraint. "The ration rules are good. Ingrid has been fair. Einar has been fair. But some families have more hands to work and some have fewer. Some have sick people, some have children. We need a clearer rule for extra portions, otherwise people will whisper." The word whisper moved through the room like smoke. Everyone knew what it meant. Suspicion. Quiet poison. Winter did not need to create enemies if whispers did it for free. Ingrid stood slowly. Her posture was calm, but the room felt her authority like the presence of a strong wall. "We will not run this village on whispers," Ingrid declared. "We will run it on decisions. Here is the decision. Children and sick people get priority broth when needed. That is not charity, that is maintenance. Adults who are healthy will accept smaller bowls when necessary. Work will be assigned with flexibility, so no one is punished for weakness that winter created. Anyone who needs help will ask, not steal, not whisper, not build a story in the dark." Einar watched faces as Ingrid spoke. Some looked relieved, some looked uneasy, because rules meant limits. But the room listened. Corin nodded slowly. "That is clear." He liked clear rules, but he also liked feeling in control, and Winter did not offer control freely. Harold raised a hand, unable to help himself. "We should also include a rule about courage." Ingrid did not roll her eyes. She did something better. She ignored it. Bram, however, looked at Harold. "The courage rule is already here. It is called staying calm and doing your tasks." Harold lowered his hand, chastened. The assembly ended with a quiet ritual, note formal. Just the shared understand that the decisions made by candlelight would matter in the dark weeks ahead. As people drifted to their sleeping areas, Einar stayed near the fire with Ingrid and Bram. The lamps flickered softly. The longhouse was quieter now, but the weight of the talk still lingered. Ingrid rubbed her hands together, not from cold, but from fatigue. "That went well," Einar observed. Ingrid looked at him. "It went as well as it could. Winter will test the rules tomorrow." Bram nodded. "Rules are like roofs. They need repairs. The repair is called honesty." Einar watched the flames. He thought of the ship that had appeared and vanished. He thought of wolves on the ridge. He thought of barrels and spoons and the way hunger made people strange. Then he looked at Ingrid, steady in the lamplight, and at Bram, steady in his age, and at the longhouse around them, steady in its stubbornness. Winter had not taken the best seat, not yet. What while they kept making decisions that held the village together? Chapter 9. The Thaw That Lies. The false thaw arrived with the kind of charm that always meant trouble. One morning the air felt almost gentle. Not warm, not friendly, but less sharp. The snow on the roof edges softened and began to drip. A thin mist rose from the fjord like the sea was exhaling after a long hold. People stepped outside and lifted their faces as if the sky had finally apologized. Harold Reed took a deep breath and looked pleased with himself, as if his earlier speeches had personally convinced the weather to behave. "You feel it," he announced to the yard. "The turn, the change. Winter is weakening." Old Bram, passing by with a bucket, offered a calm correction. "Winter does not weaken. Winter simply changes tactics." Harold watched a drip fall from the eaves. "That drip is a tactic." Bram nodded. "It is. It is called making the ground slippery, so you fall in a dignified way." Einar Stone did not trust the softness. He trusted patterns, and the pattern was this. When winter loosened its grip for a moment, it was often because it wanted people to stop gripping back. Ingrid Ashwood stood in the doorway and watched the dripping roof. Her expression stayed calm, but her eyes were busy. "We need to catch that meltwater," she observed. "If it runs under the wall, it will freeze again tonight. Then we will have a very exciting floor." Harold brightened. Exciting floors sound like a celebration. Ingrid handed him a bucket. "Then celebrate by placing this where the drip falls, quietly." Harold marched away with the bucket and a serious face, as if tasked with guarding the honor of the village. The thaw lasted only long enough to tempt people into believing it meant something. Snow turned heavy, paths became slush. The yard went from squeaky white to muddy grey, and boots collected layers like the ground was trying to keep them as souvenirs. The fjord ice near shore changed colour. It looked darker, wetter, as if it had decided to become honest about being water again. That was the danger. Strong ice announced itself. Weak ice looked like strong ice, only prettier, with a shiny surface that invited confidence. The village began to move differently. People walked faster, slipping more. Children laughed at the slush, which meant they had not yet learned that slush was not humour. Slush was a warning wearing a smile. Einar called a small meeting near the fire, short and direct. "This is the worst season for mistakes," he reminded them. "Not deep winter, not summer. This in between. Do not trust ice. Do not trust roofs. Do not trust the ground to behave like it did yesterday." Harold raised a hand. "Should we trust each other?" Bram answered, without looking up from his carving. "Trust is fine. Just do not trust Harold near ice." Harold lowered his hand, offended in the familiar way that kept him warm. The next problem arrived, because winter could not let the village enjoy even simple day. With the softer air, people began repairs too early. They saw the dripping roofs and decided it was time to remove stones and reset turf. They saw fence posts that had leaned under snow weight and decided the ground was ready for digging. The ground was not ready. The ground was pretending. Rowan and 2 others started lifting roof stones on the far shed, thinking they could fix a sagging corner while the weather was mild. The moment they removed the stones, the softened snow slid, and a section of turf shifted. Not a collapse, not disaster, but enough to reveal the truth. The roof had been held stable by weight and cold. Now it was held stable by hope, which was not a strong building material. Einar arrived to see Rowan standing on a ladder, hands on the roof edge, face tight. "Put the stones back," Einar instructed. Rowan hesitated. "We can fix it now." Einar kept his voice steady. "We can also break it now. Put the stones back. We plan the repair when the ground is solid enough to support work safely." Rowan exhaled hard, frustration mixed with exhaustion. He obeyed. Harold watched from below. This is the tragedy of spring. So close, yet so stubborn. Ingrid walked up with a coil of rope. Spring is not here. This is winter wearing a lighter cloak to see if we get foolish. Harold looked thoughtful. Winter has a sense of humour. Bram, from nearby, murmured, "Winter is the humour." They secured the roof temporarily. Einar made notes. That because notes fixed roofs, but because notes fixed future decisions, it was his style of magic. Later that day, the real near disaster happened, and it happened in the most common way. Someone decided their experience was enough to ignore a warning. A man named Leaf, confident and impatient, went toward the shoreline to check a net line that had been set near a rocky inlet. He told himself it was only a short walk, only a few steps onto the ice edge, only a quick pull. He told himself this while the ice whispered under his boots like a person clearing their throat. Soren Pike saw him from the path and called out, "Leif, do not." Leif waved his hand without turning. "I know this ice." Soren hesitated, then did the thing that showed he had truly learned something. He did not run onto the ice to prove anything. He ran to get help. Einar was near the sheds. Soren reached him breathless, words tumbling. Leif is on the ice by the inlet. It is dark. It looks weak. Einar did not ask questions that wasted time. He grabbed rope. He grabbed a long pole. He grabbed Rowan and Harold because Rowan had steady hands and Harold had loud lungs, and both could be useful if directed. Ingrid met them at the longhouse door as they moved. What? Einar answered while walking. Leif on weak ice. Rope. Ingrid did not argue. She took the rope end and followed. When emergencies arrived, Ingrid turned into motion without losing calm. Calm was her speed. They reached the shoreline and saw Leif near the inlet, bent over, tugging at a line. The ice around him was wet, darker than it should be. A shallow layer of water sat on top, a thin fill that looked harmless until it moved. Einar called out, voice firm. "Leif, stop! Back up! Slowly!" Leif looked up, annoyed. "I have it." The ice gave a soft crack, not loud but clear. Leif froze, eyes wide now. He shifted his weight and the surface sagged slightly under his boot. Harold sucked in air loudly as if preparing a heroic shout. Ingrid hissed at him, quiet and sharp. "Do not!" Harold clamped his mouth shut, looking injured by the concept of silence. Einar lowered his voice, steady, controlling the moment. "Leif, do not move fast. Do not lift your feet. Slide, slow, toward the rock." Leif swallowed. His breath came fast. He tried to slide foot, and the ice complained again. Water seeped up around his boot. It was not deep yet, but it was enough. Einar pushed the long pole out across the ice, keeping his own feet on the shore rock. Rowan anchored the rope behind him. Ingrid held the rope coil ready, eyes locked on Leif. Leif reached for the pole, fingers trembling. He got a grip. He tried to pull himself with his arms, sliding his weight rather than stepping. The ice cracked again, louder this time, and Leif made a small sound of fear he would deny later. Einar kept his voice even. "Keep pulling, keep low, do not stand." Leif obeyed. The pole bent slightly. The rope stayed ready. Slowly, Leif reached the rock edge and hauled himself onto solid ground. Ingrid immediately pushed a blanket around his shoulders. Rowan took his arm and guided him away from the water. Leif stood there shaking, wet boots, face pale. Harold could not hold it any more. You see, winter nearly unalived you. Leif glared at Harold, then at Einar, then down at the wet ice that had almost taken his confidence as payment. Einar did not scold, he did not raise his voice. He chose the approach that made people feel their own foolishness without needing help. "Now you know," Einar observed. "This is the season that lies." Leif swallowed. "I thought it would hold." Ingrid tightened the blanket. "Thinking is not enough. Ask next time." Leif nodded, shame heavy on him like wet wool. They walked back toward the longhouse. Harold followed, still buzzing with the desire to turn the event into a speech that would improve his legacy. Bram met them near the doorway, having arrived without anyone noticing, which was his preferred method. Bram looked at Leif. "You returned." "That is good." Leif nodded, barely able to meet anyone's eyes. Bram continued, voice gentle. "Next time, let the ice keep its secrets without you trying to read them with your boots." Leif managed a small tired sound that might have been agreement. That night, the longhouse felt different. Not fearful, sharper. The kind of sharp that made people listen. Einar and Ingrid adjusted routines immediately. No one went to the ice edge alone. Net checks were delayed or moved to safer spots. Fishing lines were kept near known thick ice only, and even then with rope and a partner. Harold complained about the loss of efficiency. Ingrid handed him another bucket and reminded him that efficiency was useless when you were not alive to enjoy it. The next morning, the sky cleared again. The air turned colder, as if winter had finished its little joke and returned to seriousness. The slush began to freeze into a lumpy crust. Meltwater turned into slick patches that tried to unalive ankles with quiet determination. The village moved carefully, which was the correct response. Carefulness was the only proper answer to the thaw that lied. Then another ship appeared, and the village held its breath again. This one was closer than the earlier rumour ship. Not near enough to dock, but near enough to be clearly real. It sat beyond the ice edge where open water still moved, a smaller vessel with a low mast. It did not approach quickly. It drifted, then angled away, then held position again as if unsure whether land was a gift or a trap. Einar took Rowan and Soren to the ridge and watched through the pale light. Soren spoke first, voice quiet. They looked cautious. Rowan nodded. Or weak. Einar watched the ship carefully. He noticed the sail was patched, the mast angle was slightly off. The vessel looked tired, as Soren had said before. Not a predator. A traveller caught in a season that did not care. Back at the longhouse, Einar brought the news to Ingrid and Bram. Closer ship, not approaching, possibly damaged. Ingrid considered. We do not invite strangers into the longhouse. We can offer shore trade at distance, controlled, daylight only, know what crosses ice. Harold looked thrilled. Trade at distance sounds like the beginning of a legend. Bram looked at Harold. It sounds like a sensible compromise, which is why it will not become a legend. They prepared a cautious contact plan, a fire on the shore again, a raised pole with a cloth strip to show wind direction, a small pile of trade goods visible but not close to the longhouse, dried fish and salt, modest offerings, not desperation, not wealth. Just enough to say, we can trade, but we are not a pantry with a door left open. At midday they lit the shore fire. The ship shifted slightly, then turned toward the coast, staying beyond the ice. A small boat was lowered, rowed by two figures. They stopped at the edge where open water met slushy ice and did not push farther. Einar approached with Rowan and Ingrid, rope in hand, pole in hand, and Bram behind them because Bram refused to miss human behaviour. They stopped at a safe distance on solid rock. The strangers called out in a language close enough to understand with effort. Their names were simple enough, a man called Oren and a woman called Bryn. Their accents were from farther south along the coast. Not foreign, just different. Oren raised empty hands. Trade, food, rope. We are low. Ingrid responded with controlled calm. You stay there, we stay here. We trade on the rock. No one crosses the ice. Bryn nodded quickly, agreed. They slid a small bundle across the rock using a pole. Wool cloth, rough but useful. A small metal hook, a bit of tar. In return, Ingrid slid dried fish and a pouch of salt, measured, not generous, not cruel. Oren looked relieved. Thank you. Harold, watching from farther back, could not resist. We are known for our mercy. Bram murmured. We are known for our caution. Mercy is a rumour Harold likes. The trade remained brief. No names of home villages beyond what was needed. No invitations, no threats. Just simple exchange. The strangers nodded and returned to their small boat, rowing back to their vessel. The ship turned away and moved along the coast, keeping to open water, leaving Ravenfjord behind with only a faint ripple of contact. That night the village felt steadier. Not because the thaw had ended, not because winter softened, because they had handled another test without letting fear become foolishness. Einar sat near the fire, reviewing the ledger with Ingrid. The tar and metal hook might save repairs, the wool might patch mittens, the fish and salt traded away might be missed, but not deeply. The cost felt acceptable. Ingrid looked up from the wax tablet. Today we chose balance. Einar nodded. Balance is the only thing that keeps you standing in this season. Harold, overhearing, leaned in with a grin. Balance is also how you walk on ice. Ingrid looked at him. Correct, which is why you should not walk on ice. Harold sat back, mildly wounded, and the longhouse gave a soft, tired laugh. It was the right sound for winter. Not too loud, not too hopeful, just enough to keep the darkness from thinking it owned the room. Chapter 10. Spring Sort of. Real spring did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived like a shy guest who waited outside until you stopped watching the door. At first the changes were small and easy to miss. The daylight lasted a little longer. The wind lost some of its bite. The snow on the southern slopes thinned faster than the snow in the shaded places. The fjord ice retreated in slow, reluctant steps, cracking and shifting as if annoyed by the concept of leaving. Ravenfjord did not celebrate too early. The thaw that lied had trained them. They treated every soft day as a trick until it proved itself repeatedly. Einar walked the yard one morning and noticed a sound he had not heard in weeks. Water dripping steadily, not in urgent bursts but in a controlled, gentle rhythm. The roof melt ran into channels they had carved in the snow, then into the ground that had started to accept it rather than freeze it instantly. Ingrid stood nearby, watching the same drip. "The ground is listening again," she observed. Harold, carrying a plank, looked up and grinned. "The world is thawing because it misses me." Bram from the doorway offered calm correction. "The world does not miss anyone. It simply turns, and we cling to it." Harold considered this. "That sounds rude." Bram nodded. "Nature is famous for rudeness. It is part of its charm." With the coming thaw, the village began the long process of assessing what survived. Einar and Ingrid opened every shed and counted everything again: barrels, sacks, bundles, ropes, lamp oil, tools. They did it the same way they did at the start of winter, but now the count felt like a verdict. They had less than they wanted, more than they feared. Ingrid tapped the wax tablet with her stylus. "We did well." Einar nodded. "We did well enough." Harold leaned in to see the numbers as if numbers might praise him. "How many fish remain?" Einar answered without looking up. "Enough to last until real fishing returns, not enough to make speeches about abundance." Harold sighed. "Speeches can survive on hope." Bram, seated nearby, murmured, "Hope survives best when it is fed with facts." They found damage too: a cracked beam in the far shed, a section of fence warped by wet snow, a few tools rusted where someone had failed to oil them properly. Someone, in other words, had been human. Ingrid did not scold the whole village. She quietly assigned repairs like a person moving pieces on a board. Rowan and Soren fixed the fence. Harold was assigned to cut timber to repay his earlier enthusiasm. He tried to argue that his boat had been a visionary project. Ingrid reminded him that vision still needed firewood. Harold cut timber with the pained dignity of a man suffering for art. Soren moved with more confidence now, but it was a different kind of confidence than before. Note the confidence that looked for danger, the confidence that looked for safe routes and did not apologize for caution. One afternoon he came to Einar with news. "The ridge wolves are gone." Einar looked up from his rope coil work. "Gone?" Soren nodded. "Their tracks fade toward the hills. The deer are moving lower again. The birds are louder." Bram, hearing this, offered the smallest smile. Even wolves know when a place has become too crowded with humans and their opinions. The village began to plan the first short travel to meet traders in safer conditions. Not far voyages, not heroic raids, just practical contact, the kind that kept a coastal settlement alive. A small trading point existed along the coast to the south, where people from different fjords met when the sea allowed. It was not a city, not a permanent market, more like a habit, a shared place and time where goods changed hands and people pretended it was casual. Einar decided to go with Ingrid, Rowan and Harold, because Harold would be unbearable if left behind during the first post-winter outing. Also, Harold could carry loads, which was the closest thing to a peaceful use of Harold. They prepared a modest set of trade goods: dried fish, salt, rope and a small amount of seal oil. Not much. Enough to improve their supplies, but not enough to risk hunger if trade went poorly. Before they left, Ingrid walked through the longhouse and checked on everyone in a way that looked like casual conversation. It was not casual. It was inventory of people, who looked weak, who looked restless, who needed extra broth, who needed a task so they would stop inventing problems for entertainment. Tilda and her brother were doing better. The brother still coughed, but his eyes had more life. Tilda looked steadier too, no longer carrying secret fear like a stone in her pocket. Life avoided the shoreline now like it had insulted him. Good. Shame could be useful when it trained caution. Thorn the sheep stood in the barnyard with a new confidence, as if it had decided the world was finally correcting itself. Thorn glanced at the thawing snow and bleated once, loudly, as if announcing victory. Harold heard it and nodded. "Even the sheep celebrates." Ingrid looked at Thorn. That sheep celebrates itself. The travel south was easier than winter travel, but it was not effortless. The ground was soft in places and the path along the shore was muddy. Ice still floated in the fjord, broken plates that shifted and bumped. The sea looked restless, ready to move again. They walked with packs and a small sled, using the last of the packed snow in shaded places to ease hauling. The air smelled different now. Not its smoke and salt, but damp earth, pine sap, and the faint scent of something waking. Harold breathed in deeply and smiled. This is what living feels like. Bram would have told him that living had always felt like living, just colder. Bram was not there, which meant Harold was allowed to enjoy himself briefly without correction. At the trading point, a few groups had already gathered. Small fires burned. People stood in clusters, hands moving as they spoke. The sound of many voices at once felt strange after a winter of controlled quiet. Einar kept close to Ingrid. Ingrid had the look of someone calm and unreadable, which in trade was a powerful weapon. People tended to reveal their own needs when they could not read yours. They traded fish and salt for grain, a small sack of oats, and a bit of cloth. They acquired a few iron nails, precious for repairs. They found a small jar of honey, expensive but worth it, because sometimes morale needed a taste that reminded it why it was trying. Harold tried to trade for a carved figure that he claimed would inspire the boat-building spirit. Ingrid reminded him that the boat-building spirit could be inspired by cutting timber and being quiet. Harold accepted this as a personal attack by reality, and carried the nails without complaining for nearly a full minute. They also heard news, because traders always carried news the way birds carried seeds. Farther west, along the islands, winter had been harsher. One settlement lost a store shed to a late storm. People survived, but the lesson travelled quickly. Do not trust the calm, do not trust the thaw. Einar felt a familiar cold in his chest, and then felt at ease when he remembered Ravenfjord had learned those lessons early. Someone mentioned distant routes to the south, stories of a large town across the sea where trade never fully slept, a place called York. It was spoken of like a far-off idea more than a plan, a name that carried promise and risk together. Harold heard York and brightened. We should go there one day. Ingrid looked at him. We should keep everyone alive this week. Harold nodded. Small steps. They returned to Ravenfjord with their new supplies and a sense of the world widening again. The longhouse greeted them with smoke and warmth. People gathered to see what they brought. Ingrid did not let excitement turn into chaos. She directed supplies into sheds, assigned the honey to be used sparingly, and told children they could smell it but not touch it. Children protested. Ingrid did not change. That evening, Bram announced a story circle to mark the turn of the season. Not a celebration of victory, a marking of endurance. People sat by the fire, the air soft with spring damp rather than winter bite. The roof hole still let smoke out and let cold in, but the cold no longer felt like an enemy, more like a reminder. Bram spoke of winter as a teacher, but he did not praise it. Bram never praised winter. Bram treated winter the way you treated a difficult neighbour, with respect, distance, and a strong doorbeam. Einar listened and felt the season settle into memory, the loud storm, the quiet hunger week, the thaw that lied, the careful trade, the small kindness that saved Tilda and her brother from turning fear into theft, the sheep that refused winter and then accepted salve like it had been given a crown. When Bram finished, the longhouse stayed quiet for a moment, not because anyone was sad, because the silence fit. It held the weight of what they had done without needing extra decoration. Later, Einar stepped outside alone. The sky was clear, stars softened by a faint haze. The fjord water moved more freely now, ice broken and drifting. The shore was wet and dark, but not as cruel as it had been. He listened to the water. It did not crack like it used to. It moved with a low, steady sound that felt almost familiar again. Footsteps approached. Ingrid joined him, cloak wrapped close, face calm. The stores are better now, Ingrid observed. Not rich, better. Einar nodded. Better is enough. Ingrid looked out at the fjord. We will plant again soon, we will fish again, we will complain about rain instead of ice. That will feel like luxury. Einar allowed a small smile. Rain is polite compared to winter. Ingrid glanced at him. Do not say that too loudly. Winter might hear and take it personally. Einar looked at the dark water and the faint starlight on it. He thought of the season ahead. It would bring work too, different work, but still work. Survival did not end. It simply changed its clothing. He looked back at the longhouse. Warm light, quiet voices, the smell of smoke and stew and damp wool. The village had held, not perfectly, not heroically. It had held in the way that mattered. Ingrid stood beside him and breathed slowly, steady as ever. Spring is here, sort of, Einar observed. Ingrid nodded. Sort of is better than not at all. They went back inside. The fire waited. The benches waited. The quiet routines waited. The world outside would continue to turn, indifferent and persistent, and Ravenfjord would continue to answer with planning, patience, and just enough sarcasm to keep fear from thinking it had won.